has Putin gone full mask off in his efforts to find peace in Ukraine? Is he now talking about final solutions for the Ukrainian state? Just what does this mean, and why was I right all along? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a really interesting story that is basically in response to Putin and Ukrainian President Hungarian President Viktor Orban having a extensive meeting, right? Orban tried to position himself as a little bit of a bridge between the authoritarian Moscow and the more democratic norms of the EU, given that Viktor Orban kind of sits between those two as a strong man with a pretty heavy level of power consolidation within Hungary. But following this conference, Putin, instead of being more conciliatory, actually became much, much more strident. He said on Friday, Putin, that he's seeking a complete and final end, that's his actual words, to the Ukraine conflict, rather than, quote, some kind of truce or ceasefire. So it's pretty crazy for him to sit there and explicitly say, I never really wanted a ceasefire, right? To actually be like, a ceasefire? No, I don't want it. And I don't want a truce. I want a complete and final end to the conflict, right? Now, here's where things get even more interesting, is that he referenced a term that up until this point has been kind of focused primarily on the Russian audience. It's been a term Putin's used domestically. And before we talk about what that term is, I want to point out that if you're trying to enhance your own efforts here, you don't need to consolidate power and become a military strongman. You might just need some Strike Gum. Strike Gum is the zero sugar energy drink alternative. It's made in the USA, veteran owned, and has all the caffeine of a Red Bull and none of the sugar. And we're running our 4th of July sale. We, of course, as an American brand, are here to spread independence across the world. And independence from being undercaffeinated, of course. So our 4th of July sale is 20% off, period. That's it. No discount codes, no friggin' give us your email, none of that stuff. It's just less expensive, and it's worldwide. So if you're in the EU or Australia or Canada or any of these other countries, now's your chance, right? Go in, order it, and any order over $25 automatically going to get 20% off. So finally, you guys can enjoy the freedom from fatigue that thousands of other people have already. Now, if you want, you can get Strike Gum on Amazon, sure, but that's not where the discount is. The discount is on strikegum.com. So check it out. Okay, so here's the interesting terminology that Putin has begun to roll out. And he called for, as part of his efforts to, again, establish a ceasefire, the ceasefire that Putin, of course, doesn't really want. But if he were to have a ceasefire, he would demand that Ukraine withdraw from, quote, Donbas and Novorussia. And Novorussia is really interesting because at the start of this war, there was a kind of Russian state ideology backed by one kind of fringe academic that said that Russia wasn't the true state of Russia was much bigger, right? That it was supposed to be a huge land that basically expanded to the Tsarist borders, right? Where Russia was a European great power. Think from like the 1600s to like the 1800s, right? That was kind of the apex of historic Russia. And the Tsarist Empire, according to this academic, I think his name is Durbin, he says, Russia in its current form is like a fraction of a state. He said it's sort of like if the United States was only the eastern seaboard. We would say, no, the U.S. is 50 states. This is how big our state is. And so, but the difference is that there's a lot of key differences, notably that Putin has taken it upon himself and said, I want to expand Russia to its historic imperial boundaries. This is good and right. And, of course, it's going to cement his legacy as one of Russia's great leaders, which is, I think, his priority at this point in his life. And so this Novorussia project is a core part of that. This is sort of Putin's military. His idea is that it precedes or it follows an ideological conquest first, where he creates this idea that anybody who speaks Russian is actually a Russian, right? Sort of like saying everybody who speaks English is American, which we'd say that's stupid. There's lots of countries that speak English that aren't American. But this is the Putinist ideology. He says, I'm going to convince all these Russian speakers that they're really Russian. And in places like occupied Ukraine, they oftentimes would issue passports to Ukrainian citizens and say, here's a Russian passport. You're a Russian citizen now because you speak Russian. And they play these kind of games. They even have some NGOs who call themselves like Friends of the Russian speaking peoples or whatever, Friends of Russia, Comrades of Russia. And this is the idea is that Putin wants to create Russian loyalists in other places beyond Russia's borders so that when their military enters, they are welcomed, right? And this project, this sort of region is referred to as Novo Russia. But up until this point, we've only seen Putin kind of orient that term when speaking to his domestic audience, to the Russian speaking audience. It's never come and been told to the West, hey, I have this Novo Russia project. And you probably understand why, right? This idea that there's a right type of person to occupy certain lands and that the right people need more living room, so to speak, to fulfill their like destiny or whatever, is reminiscent of some of the absolute worst figures in history, right? And those worst figures in history have done some horrible things to the wrong ethnicities that are inappropriately living on the lands that belong to the right people. You see how incredibly fraught this ideology is. And Putin knows it. That's why he doesn't say it to the West. But now, again, he's saying that he's rolling out this ideology. He's literally telling people, okay, for any kind of ceasefire to take place, and this is the real preposterous part, right? Understand this. For a ceasefire, not a lasting peace, not a final peace negotiations, for negotiations to start, one, Ukraine has to withdraw from Donbas and Novo Russia, which I looked it up. There is no official definition of Novo Russia. Again, but the Tsarist Empire included basically all of southern Ukraine, almost all of the Black Sea and Azov Sea coastlines, Odessa, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, Mariupol, Mykolaiv, and Kherson. But if Putin wants to get even more historically expansive, the Tsarist Empire at times also included large areas of northeastern Ukraine, right? So, again, including Luhansk, Donetsk, Mykolaiv, Odessa. So, huge, expansive, right? He's demanding an expansive Ukrainian withdrawal. And more than that, he's demanding something else. Again, for a ceasefire. Not a permanent solution, but to start negotiations. He said, Ukraine must have an irreversible demilitarization as a prerequisite to negotiations. Right? Now, this is a talking point that Putin has rolled out for a long time, but I want you guys to think through this, okay? Let's say Ukraine goes, okay, sure, Putin. We're gonna disband our entire military to start negotiations. Now they sit at the table, and Putin goes, all right, condition one, the current government of Ukraine leaves the country, and the Kremlin installs our puppet government in Kiev. And Kiev, Ukraine goes, absolutely not. That's preposterous. There's no negotiation to be had here. What can Ukraine do about that? As discussed, the ceasefire prerequisite is have no military. So with no military, how can you, what carrots and sticks do you have to negotiate with? Right? Again, a ceasefire with two sides with big militaries, they have the ultimate carrot and stick, which is I can start to kill you again. We can return to a state of conflict. But once you lose the ability to do that, right? There's war and there's peace. That's it. Those are the two aspects, right? So if you sit there and go, listen, there's no conflict right now. There is a ceasefire. There is peace. The only stick you have is to return to a state of conflict. It's called a deterrent, and this is what every country's military does. This is why the U.S. has a huge military. It's not because we really, really, really wanted to make sure we could, mess with the Taliban. Taliban are a side project. right? The primary existence of the U.S. military, just like its nuclear deterrent, is to tell any Russian-style authoritarian that says, listen, if you mess with the United States or any of our treaty-bound allies, our huge stick, like 50 armored brigades, we're going to beat you over the head with it. And that allows the United States to negotiate a lot of peaceful conditions. Imagine if suddenly the U.S. said, we're not going to defend the South China Sea. Our allies are on their own. And they have tiny militaries, right? They all have tiny militaries. China would go, okay. They'd knock on Japan's door and go, hey, we have a huge military, and we've decided we own the South China Sea. So negotiations are starting here. We're going to be occupying these islands. What can Japan do? Nothing. Militarize very quickly, right? So this is why when you see these kind of things, you have to understand the difference between a sincere negotiation, a sincere conditions for negotiations, right? And those could definitely be, there are definitely preconditions to negotiations that can be sincere. And, you know, like it wouldn't be crazy. A more sincere Putin might say, hey, as a requisite, both our forces have to withdraw 10 kilometers, create a demilitarized zone between along the conflict line. Or something, right? Those sort of things, you know, we have to create localized demilitarized zones or something, right? Or to say, hey, I want to create a no-fly zone, right? Some of those negotiations are true, but when they become preposterous like this, you just need to understand the real message that I'm surprised Putin has just come out and said, where he said, I don't really want a ceasefire. I just want total and complete capitulation of the Ukrainian government. And as he has said himself, the Novo Russia project holds that Ukraine can never be a separate state. So that is his he said, my final solution is the elimination of Ukraine as a state. Not his word, not my words, his. This isn't speculation. This is literally the words he has said. It's like Ukraine shouldn't exist as a separate state. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. A huge thank you to the Colonel tier members of CombatVetNews.com, Dale Packard, Chris Holmes, Daniel Brown, Bobby Sue, Scott Keel, Tib Pastor, and Babaloo. I appreciate you guys, and I appreciate all our Colonel tier members. Could not do this without you guys. You guys are really carrying the channel, frankly. And I appreciate you so much. I hope you're enjoying the twice weekly uncensored combat videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.